Anyway, I'm pleased to introduce to you our speaker today. Taylor attended a college up in New Jersey, so do not hold that against him. Unfortunately, he did not wear his college colors, as Bob did. Taylor is a classmate of a senator from New Jersey, Bill Bradley, who also played basketball, class of 1965. Taylor is an attorney. I met Taylor when he was in practice in Richmond at his office a number of years ago. And he also comes from a family that is quite entrenched in running colleges. His father was the president of Hampton-Sydney, where my son-in-law, or my brother-in-law went there. And his son is president, I believe, at Longwood. So, if I have that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce William Mary President Taylor Reveley.
Thank you, Clay. Bob, I love your jacket.
And he doesn't care what anybody says.
Of course, it's not quite as beautiful as mine, which works on Halloween beautifully, and not on many other occasions. I've given Clay a complete opportunity, after 20 minutes elapses, if I'm still talking, to stand up and say, enough, and I will gracefully subside. Well, in the wake of all that's happened in recent weeks in Charleston, South Carolina, and then in the South Carolina legislature, I thought it might be timely for me to ruminate a bit with you all about William and Mary and the Civil War. Now, that savage conflict that convulsed our country from 1861 to 1865, convulsed Virginia in particular, has been named various things. In days gone by in the South, often it was simply the war, or the war between the states, the war of northern aggression, the war of late unpleasantness. In the North, the war of the rebellion, or the war of emancipation. But most often these days, it's just the Civil War. And I think the name the conflict has been given in the past, it's probably reflective of particular views and passions of the person doing the naming. But whatever the name, the conflict made quite a home for itself in Williamsburg and on the campus of William and Mary. As we all know, Williamsburg sits on a peninsula that narrows just west of town, creating a funnel that if you're trying to push tens of thousands of troops from Norfolk to Richmond, you got to go up. And that was obviously the intent of the Federal Army early in the war and throughout the war. But it took a year for the Battle of Williamsburg to occur. A year after the war began, the battle was on May the 5th, 1862. Roughly 20,000 soldiers on each side. It was a bloody day, but an inconclusive day. Confederates then withdrew to the west, closer to the defenses of Richmond. And Williamsburg, especially the campus of William and Mary, became an armed camp for the remaining 3 years of the war. And except for occasional forays by Confederate troops, town and the college were occupied by federal forces. Occupying troops, of course, were viewed with great hostility by the white population, obviously not by the black inhabitants of Williamsburg. But whether black or white, the war was intensely personal for the people who then lived in Williamsburg. As to William and Mary itself, it had been abandoned by its faculty, staff, students at the outset of the war. The college's glorious Sir Christopher Wren building, which came online in the late 1600s, was first a barracks for Confederate troops and then federal troops. And in due course, on September the 9th, 1862, It was burned by Union soldiers. I think they were the 5th Pennsylvania Cavalry. And this occurred in retaliation for a Confederate raid on the town and the campus that had surprised the Pennsylvanians, routed them, embarrassed them. Once they regained control, they got drunk, set the run on fire, and prevented the townspeople who tried to put it out from getting close to it. Other buildings and homes on campus were vandalized during the war. Books were burned, stolen, manuscripts perished. It wasn't until 1893, on the 200th anniversary of William and Mary's founding, that Congress finally appropriated $64,000. That was real money then. Finally appropriated $64,000 to partially indemnify the college and help restore the Wren building. And former Union generals Grant, Sherman, McClellan, and Meade supported that congressional action. General Meade said, "The destruction of the building at William and Mary College was one of those deplorable acts of useless destruction which occur in all wars." William and Mary's first attempt to get redress from Congress for the burning of the Wren had reached the House Committee on Southern Claims in March. Of course, had not been an institution loyal to the Union. So it took a quarter century before congressional hearts softened. Now, I think for most young people today, most William and Mary students, the Civil War pretty much occupies a space in time more or less in the vicinity of the civil wars among the Romans, or perhaps the English during the wars of the War of the Roses. All of them great fratricidal struggles in their own time, but now lost to history. But I do realize that the recent events in South Carolina, I think in particular, have, even for the young, brought the Civil War somewhat to life again. And actually, it wasn't that long ago, and it still does have compelling lessons to teach us. Now, William and Mary was no stranger to war in 1861. Our students, our alumni, had fought in all of America's colonial wars and early national struggles. During the Revolutionary War, when the British invaded Virginia, they came to Williamsburg. They seized the campus. Lord Cornwallis took over the president's house, kicked the poor president and his family out, would not even let them draw water from the well in the garden. But Cornwallis didn't get to stay long. He and troops moved on to Yorktown, and the French, our friends, came. And they used the Wren building and the president's house as military hospitals. And one of the three ghosts that now lives in the president's house is indeed the disembodied spirit of a French soldier who died in the house while being used as a military hospital. And he chose, for whatever reason, to stay in the house rather than returning to Paris. I have yet to meet him. French caught the house on fire by accident. French king paid to repair it. But by the time it was over, the campus had been badly damaged and the life of the school badly interrupted by the Revolutionary War. As the cloud of civil war began to gather in the United States in the late 1850s, early 1860, the president of William and Mary, a fellow named Benjamin S. Ewell, bitterly opposed secession, bitterly opposed it, and tried very hard to dampen secessionist feeling among the students. He loved the Union. He didn't want to see it split. But once his native Virginia left the Union, Ewell, like Lee, Robert E. Lee, was unwilling to part with his state, his home, his people. He was a graduate of West Point, joined the Confederate Army, as did most of William and Mary's faculty, staff, and students. But an extremely prominent William and Mary alumnus of that era, probably the most prominent William and Mary alumnus of that era, stuck with the Union, made the opposite call, even though he was deeply rooted in Virginia, and that was Winfield Scott, a native of Dinwiddie County in Virginia, who then was the longest serving general in the United States Army. Indeed, no one will ever serve as a general officer in the United States Army as long as Scott did. And at the outbreak of the Civil War, he was in command of all federal military forces. Virginia offered him command at the beginning of the war of its troops, but Scott would not abandon his allegiance to the Union, for which he had fought so long, starting in the War of 1812. He devised the so-called Anaconda strategy that ultimately was crucial in strangling the South. And he tried to enlist Robert E. Lee to command the federal forces after him. So as with all civil wars, it was a time of divided loyalties and really agonizing choices for people. When the war ended, the campus was in ruins, its faculty, staff, and student bodies scattered, its endowment wasted. Confederate bonds proved to be a really awful asset class. But under the indomitable leadership of President Ewell, William and Mary struggled to reopen. And finally classes resumed in 1869, but then they had to be suspended again in 1881. Lack of funds, lack of students. Got underway again 7 years later. And during this sad time, even when the campus was not in session, Ewell climbed the steps of the Wren building annually to ring its bell, to remind everyone who heard and who still had faith in William and Mary that the college would live, would open again, would rise again. And William and Mary did rise again, and did so in Williamsburg, despite really strong efforts to move it either to Norfolk or to Richmond. Because when the capital of Virginia moved from Williamsburg to Richmond, what had been a thriving political, economic, social center for the state decamped, and Williamsburg became something of a backwater. Not the backwater today. Williamsburg kept William and Mary, and of course it'd be a very different school if it had moved either to Richmond or Norfolk. And I think William and Mary refused to die in part, even though it really, by all objective measures, should have died then. Because many people in both the South and the North refused to let a college where Presidents Jefferson, Monroe, and Tyler had been undergraduates, where John Marshall, the great Chief Justice of the United States, had been among the first law students at William and Mary, where George Wythe had taught, where George Washington had been our first American chancellor after the Revolutionary War, and gotten the only piece of paper he got from any college. Uncharacteristically, he forgot to pay for it, but he didn't get anything from anybody else. All of that, and of course William and Mary and Williamsburg's seminal role in the creation of both Virginia and the United States. People simply refused to let a college with that rich history die. One reason the college didn't ultimately die is that in 1906, it gave itself to the Commonwealth of Virginia. It deeded all of its real and personal property to the Commonwealth of Virginia. in return for operating support. Thus, the college's Board of Visitors, which traced its ancestry back in an unbroken line to the first board appointed in 1693, was dissolved. College ceased to be private, got a board appointed by the governor, and has been public ever since. It did get operating support, at least for a while. We're now down to about 12% of our operating budget. But of course, as a state entity, it also had to do what the state wanted it to do. And initially, the state said, all right, you can become a state school, but in return, you got to turn yourself into a state normal school in part, meaning a school that prepares teachers for the K-12 system, which William and Mary did brilliantly for a couple of generations, to the great benefit of the Commonwealth in particular. And then again, giving ourselves to the state in 1918 wasn't quite enough for financial stability. So in 1918, William and Mary was the first single-sex school in Virginia to admit the other sex. We admitted women. Once again, leading the way. And that provided enough students and enough tuition to keep us going. Meanwhile, while all this was going on at William and Mary, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, fueled by the fruits of a victorious Union, undamaged by civil war, mushed on at flank speed, amassing wealth. And I think these days, William and Mary really is the paradigm of what's called the public Ivy. We're not like Harvard, Princeton, and Yale because they're all private and we're public, but otherwise, our deep commitment to the liberal arts, our commitment to research and undergraduate teaching, our history, our physical beauty, all make us the classic paradigm of an Ivy. And I really think, but for the Civil War, there's more than a fighting chance that William and Mary today would be the southernmost of the Ivy League schools. So what's the first lesson of the Civil War for William and Mary? If you're an institution of higher education, it never pays to be on the wrong and the losing side of the great Civil War that is fought on your campus. Just don't do it. And William and Mary was on the wrong and not just the losing side of the Civil War. And the second lesson of the Civil War for William and Mary, and I think for institutions and people in general, is it often takes a very long time to respond fairly and responsibly to the bitter realities of defeat. And it did take William and Mary a very long time to come to grips with its racial past. The college owned slaves before the Civil War. It was segregated long after the Civil War ended. The only role then for African Americans on campus was menial. They came to campus early and they left at night after days of hard work. Our first black student didn't come until 1951, and he was a part-time master's candidate. Our first black graduate was a law student who graduated in 1954. The first black African Americans to live on campus were 3 women who arrived in 1967, graduated in 1971. It took until 1978 before we had our first African American member of Phi Beta Kappa. He was Brian Blunt, who is now president of Union Presbyterian Seminary in Richmond. The first African American rector of our Board of Visitors, Michael Powell, led the board for 2 years. ending in 2009. And as I'm sure some of you know, William and Mary is now heavily into a project that it has been working on for almost 4 years, called the Lemon Project, designed to take a thorough, complete, really hard look at our racial past, see what we can learn from it. Though I think it is important when talking about William and Mary's racial past to note that despite the fact it's largely a story of slavery, secession, segregation until modern times, William and Mary was the first institution of higher education in the United States to create a school for black children, slave as well as free, on campus. That school got underway in 1760. And the founder of William and Mary's Law School in 1779, George Wythe, now largely lost to history, but a great human being in his time, was an adamant opponent of slavery, and indeed deemed it, when he was on the bench, a judge, unconstitutional under the Virginia Constitution, though his decision didn't hold. Perhaps a third, and this is the last one I'll mention, lesson of the Civil War is the difficulty people have reaching, and we still have, reaching a balanced view of such a catastrophic struggle. For a good while after the war ended, and after Reconstruction ended, at one end of the continuum, at one far end of the continuum, there was serious emphasis on a grossly romantic and grossly unrealistic view of the Old South, awash in white columned mansions, allegedly happy slaves, an aristocratic code of honor and historic agrarian virtues, and courageous resistance by Confederate troops in the teeth of vastly superior federal resources despite brilliant Southern generals. Now we're at the other end of the continuum, and the Civil War is viewed wholly through the horrors of slavery and the necessity to end it. But this too, in my judgment, oversimplifies more complex reality. Many people in the North went to war initially to preserve the Union, and even late in the war, that was a crucial federal goal. And in the South, as I think President Ewell exemplified, loyalty to family, loyalty to home, loyalty to state had enormous power, infinitely greater power than we understand them to be today, or than they are today. And of course, people have always resisted an invader wherever found across the world, simply because they fear the invader threatens their loved ones in their homes. And of course, it's quite possible for Southerners whose forebears fought for the Confederacy to remember their ancestors' valor and sacrifice without sharing their racial views. But enough about the Civil War and William and Mary, its part in it and after it. The university is thriving these days. We've got 5 schools: arts and sciences, business, education, law, marine science. Over the last 50 years, we have become a serious research university without sacrificing our historic commitment to undergraduate teaching. That is extraordinarily rare. Almost always, when a university becomes a research university, busily creating new knowledge, it throws its undergraduate program under the wheels. And the undergraduates find themselves taught by adjuncts taught by what's called contingent faculty with no status in the body politic. While the tenured professors spend their time doing research and talking to one another and going to conferences. That isn't the way we do it at William and Mary. We're both into creating knowledge big time and expect it of our tenured faculty. But we also expect them to teach, and to teach undergraduates if they're in arts and sciences, and they do. That's extremely rare. Frankly, our only competition on that front is not another public school, because there's no public school that has no public research university that has our commitment to undergraduates. The competition is, of course, Princeton, and to a lesser degree, Dartmouth. Enough from me. Did I make my 20 minutes?
Yes, sir.
All right.